I want to start with a number that genuinely just stopped me in my tracks while I was reading through this.
Okay.
The year is 2043. We're looking at U.S. Census data, and according to the projections, that is the specific tipping point.
Hmm.
That is the year when so-called non-dominant racial groups are expected to officially become the majority of the U.S. population.
It's a massive demographic shift. I
Yeah.
mean, we're talking about a fundamental restructuring of who makes up the fabric of the country.
Right, and seeing that number, my immediate thought was, okay, well, surely the field of mental health is preparing for this.
You'd think so.
If the population is shifting that drastically, the way we treat people's minds must be shifting too. But then I read the next part of the source material, and, well, it seems like the industry is playing catch up.
Playing catch-up is a generous way to put it. The source material highlights a pretty stark reality.
Yeah.
Despite this diversity boom, you have clients from these non-dominant groups who are frequently, terminating counseling prematurely, or they're getting diagnosed incorrectly, which is dangerous, or they just report feeling talked down to.
That is the core tension we need to figure out today. You have a society that is rapidly diversifying, but a mental health system that historically wasn't really built for that diversity.
Exactly. It was built by and for a very specific demographic, mostly. I mean, we're talking early 20th century Western Europe and America.
Mm-hmm.
So the mission of this deep dive is to explore culturally competent counseling. And I want to be clear right off the bat, this isn't just about manners.
Yeah.
This isn't about a counselor just being nice or politically correct.
The text actually calls it a revolution in psychology. They refer to it as the fourth and fifth forces of helping, which sounds very Star Wars, but it implies this is a big deal.
It is a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
The author of our text actually shares this personal story that I think just frames the problem perfectly. They grew up in New York City, right?
Right.
Surrounded by everything, eating sushi, listening to Latin music, seeing Nigerian clothes on the street. And they thought, I'm multicultural. I get it.
Which is a trap I think a lot of us fall into. We confuse consumption with comprehension.
Precisely. The author admits they could taste the food, but they didn't understand the world those people lived in.
Wow.
They didn't get the values, the fears, the family structures. And in therapy, if you don't understand the world the client lives in, you can't help them navigate it.
So if we're moving past that I like sushi level of cultural awareness, we have to talk about the metaphors we use. I grew up hearing the American melting pot as like the ultimate ideal. You know, everyone comes here, jumps in the pot, and we all melt into one big, happy American soup.
Right.
But the source material basically says this metaphor is toxic for therapy. Why?
Well, think about the physics of melting. To melt into a soup, you have to lose your distinct shape.
You have to dissolve.
You have to dissolve. The source argues that for a long time, counseling operated on this assimilation myth. The goal was to help the client fit in to the dominant culture.
So if a counselor assumes a client should melt, they're essentially telling the client, you need to be less like you and more like us.
Right. And here's a concrete example from the text that just made me cringe.
Okay.
Imagine a counselor working with a client who lives in a poor, culturally specific neighborhood. Maybe it's a tight-knit immigrant community. The counselor, thinking they're helping, suggests the client should move to a safer and usually implied whiter part of town.
On the surface, that sounds like logical advice. Move to a safer area.
To the counselor, it looks like safety. But to the client, that neighborhood is their motherboard. That's where their grandmother lives, where the grocer speaks their language, where they feel spiritually safe.
You're isolating them.
If you push them to leave, you aren't fixing their anxiety, you're isolating them. That is the melting pot failing.
The alternative the text proposes is the cultural mosaic.
Yes, in a mosaic, every piece keeps its unique color, its sharp edges, but they all fit together to make a larger picture. You don't dissolve, you contribute.
This tension between the old way and the new way really shows up when we talk about values. I was struck by the section on individualism versus collectivism.
Oh, yeah.
Because, let's be honest, traditional therapy is very me, me, me. It's about my boundaries, my happiness, my journey.
It's heavily Eurocentric. It values self-disclosure, spilling your guts and autonomy. But the source gives us this great counterexample. A Vietnamese client.
Okay.
The counselor is pushing them to express deep, jagged feelings about their family's difficult immigration story. Let it out! Tell me how angry you are.
And the client is just sitting there, quiet.
And the counselor thinks, this client is resistant, they're in denial, but they're wrong.
How so?
In that client's cultural context, emotional restraint isn't a symptom of repression. It's
No.
a high-value trait. It's about respect and harmony.
So the counselor is pathologizing a cultural virtue.
Exactly.
There was another example that I found even more tricky. An American Indian client trying to decide whether to get married. The counselor gives the standard pep talk. Well, what do you want? You can't let others decide for you.
Which sounds like empowerment, right?
Totally. But the client is saying, I need to consult the elders first.
And the counselor hears dependency.
But the client is actually exercising wisdom.
Exactly. If you force that client to make a decision in a vacuum, cut off from their community, you aren't empowering them. You're actually weakening them. You're asking them to act against their own value system.
This misunderstanding isn't just about awkward conversations, though. It gets dangerous.
It does.
The source brought up a statistic about misdiagnosis that I honestly found terrifying. It mentioned African American males and schizophrenia.
This is where we see institutional bias becoming a clinical error. The data shows that African American males are diagnosed with schizophrenia at significantly higher rates than other groups.
I have to play devil's advocate here. Is it possible that the prevalence of the disease is just higher in that demographic?
That's a fair question, but the research says no. The biological prevalence is consistent. The discrepancy comes from the interview.
So what's going wrong in the room?
It's the interpretation of behavior. You have a white clinician trained in a very specific style of communication. They sit down with a black male client who might be displaying a certain guardedness or even a healthy cultural paranoia, which is a valid survival mechanism.
A survival mechanism in a society that hasn't always been safe for them.
Right. And the clinician reads that guardedness as pathology.
Exactly. They mistake a cultural defense mechanism for a symptom of mental illness. And once that label schizophrenia is on your medical record, it changes your life.
It changes the medication you're given, the stigma you face. It's a massive failure of the system.
It is.
That really drives home why this isn't just academic. We're talking about people's lives being derailed because a counselor didn't understand the code the client was speaking.
And to fix that, we have to look at the language we use. The text forces us to start and redefine some big terms. The biggest one being race. The source is pretty blunt. Race is a social construct, not a biological one.
The science is irrefutable on this. Genetically, humans share 99.9% of their DNA. The physical differences we focus on, skin color, hair texture, eye shape, that all lives in that tiny 0.1%.
But if it's so small, if it's scientifically negligible, why are we centering an entire counseling framework around it? Why not just say we're all the same?
Because social construct doesn't mean imaginary. Money is a social construct, right? It's just paper and digital numbers. But if you have $0, your suffering is very real. Race matters because of the social reality attached to those physical traits.
The oppression, the privilege.
The access to resources, those are real consequences of a made-up category.
That leads us to intersectionality. I feel like this word gets thrown around on Twitter a lot, but in a clinical setting, how does it actually change a diagnosis?
Think of it as looking at the compounding effect. The text uses a wheel visual with all these isms: ageism, ableism, classism. Intersectionality is the understanding that a black woman doesn't experience racism on Monday and sexism on Tuesday.
She experiences them as a single combined force.
Exactly. The experience of being a black woman is distinct from the experience of a white woman and distinct from the experience of a black man. It's a unique intersection. If Kessler tries to treat her stress by only looking at the woman part or only the race part, they're missing her reality.
Speaking of complex identities, we have to talk about the genderbread person.
I was wondering when we'd get to the cookie.
It's a cute visual, but I want to know why a serious clinical textbook is using a cartoon cookie. What is the actual utility for a therapist?
It's a tool to decouple assumptions. We tend to bundle things together. We assume if someone looks a certain way, their body, they must identify a certain way, their mind, and they must date a certain type of person, their attraction.
And the genderbread person just breaks those apart.
Yeah, it separates identity, which is in the brain, attraction in the heart, sex, which is anatomical, and expression, the external outline.
So the insight for the counselor is that these four things don't always align in a standard package.
Right. You can have a client with male biology who identifies as female, presents as androgynous, and is attracted to women. If the counselor assumes one leads to the others, they're going to alienate that client immediately.
The text also made a point to shift from the word minority to non-dominant group. That felt like a very deliberate choice.
It is. Minority is a math term. It implies fewer than.
But as we said in the intro, the math is flipping.
Exactly. Non-dominant speaks to power. Even if a group is large in number, if they don't hold the institutional power, they are non-dominant. It acknowledges the hierarchy, not just the head count.
Okay, so we've established the problem, the barriers, and the vocabulary. Now we need the actual roadmap. How does a counselor actually do this?
Right.
The source gives us an acronym that, well, let's be honest, it's a mouthful. MSJCC.
The Multicultural and Social Justice Counseling Competencies. It doesn't exactly roll off the tongue.
Not at all. But the visual they use, this target or bullseye, is helpful. Walk us through it. What's in the center?
The bullseye is counselor self-awareness. This is non-negotiable. The text argues you cannot help someone else navigate their world until you understand your own position in it.
There's an exercise mentioned for this called the privilege walk. I've actually seen videos of this. It's intense.
It's very visceral. You have a group of people stand side by side in a line. Then a facilitator reads statements. If your parents paid for your college, take a step forward.
If you were ever followed in a store by security, take a step backward.
If you see people who look like you on TV, step forward.
And by the end, people who started together are scattered all across the room.
Right. And the realization, which is often emotional, is that the people at the front didn't work harder to get there. They just had the wind at their backs.
So for a counselor, realizing, oh, I'm standing at the front of the room, helps them understand the power dynamic when a client walks in who's been at the back their whole life.
Exactly. And that power dynamic is actually part of the bullseye too, the counseling relationship. The text talks about these quadrants of power.
This is fascinating stuff.
It is. Imagine a grid. It's easy to understand the dynamic when it's a privileged counselor and a marginalized client, say, a wealthy white male doctor and a poor immigrant client. The power is all on one side.
But what happens when it flips? What about a marginalized counselor and a privileged client?
That's where it gets complex.
Yeah.
Let's say you have a female counselor of color treating a wealthy, influential white man.
Okay.
The counselor has the clinical authority. She's the doctor. But the client holds the societal power.
That has to be awkward.
It creates friction. The client might unconsciously or consciously challenge your expertise. Where did you get your degree? You sure you know what you're doing? If the counselor isn't trained to recognize that power play, the therapy just falls apart.
I want to ground this in a real story because abstract quadrants can only get us so far. The text provides a detailed case study of a man named John McGowan. I'd love to dig into this because it proves that culture isn't just about race.
John is a perfect example. He's 70 years old, Irish-American, a widower, and he has recently become visually impaired.
So, paint the picture. John's daughter drags him to therapy. He's depressed. He's crying over his breakfast. He's still in his pajamas at noon.
A standard medical model counselor looks at John and checks the boxes. Crying. Check. Loss of interest. Check. Diagnosis. Major depressive disorder.
And the treatment.
John, tell me how you feel about your wife. Let it all out.
And how does John respond to that?
He shuts down completely. He probably never comes back.
Why?
Because John is a traditional Irish-American man of a certain generation. The text specifically mentions the Irish sense of privacy. To him, spilling his guts to a stranger isn't healing. It's shameful. It's invasive. The direct approach attacks his dignity.
So what does the culturally competent counselor do? How do they unlock John?
First, they respect the disability. The text mentions the sighted guide technique. The counselor asks, "Would you like to take my arm?" to guide him to the chair. They describe the room.
They give him back his agency.
Exactly. And regarding the sadness.
Yeah.
They don't attack it head on. They use indirect communication. They might use humor or storytelling. They chat about his life, his work. They build trust through a side door rather than kicking down the front door of his emotions.
The text also mentions validating his loss of role.
This is huge. He wasn't just a husband. He was the protector, the provider. Now he feels like a burden. A competent counselor validates that specific loss of manhood and independence. They frame his depression not as a brain sickness, but as a reasonable reaction to losing his station in life.
That feels so much more humane.
And practical. The text mentions he lost his wife's pension. A standard counselor might ignore that. A competent counselor realizes, wait, this guy is broke. That's the economic part of his stress.
This brings up another acronym the source lists. Respectful.
Yes. It's a checklist to make sure you don't miss things like that.
I'm not going to read the whole list because it's long, but it includes things like religious, economic, chronological.
And the point of the list isn't to memorize it for a quiz. It's a safety net against tunnel vision. A counselor might be so focused on the psychological, the depression,
Yeah.
that they miss the chronological, where is he in his
Well,
lifespan?
or the economic, it forces you to look at the whole human.
Exactly.
This holistic view seems to lead to the final big concept in the text, the fourth and fifth forces.
Right. If we look at the history of psychology, we started with Freud, the first force. Psychodynamic. Lie on the couch, talk about mom.
Then we got the second force, behavioral, Skinner and his rats, conditioning.
Then the third force, humanistic. Carl Rogers. Be all you can be, self-actualization.
And now...
Now we are in the era of the fourth force, multicultural counseling, acknowledging that we don't exist in a vacuum. But the fifth force, that's the one that really changes the job description.
The fifth force is social justice, which sounds more like activism than therapy.
It blurs the line. Imagine a client who is depressed because they are being underpaid at work due to discrimination.
Okay.
You can give them all the breathing exercises in the world. You can prescribe antidepressants, but the root cause is that they're being exploited.
So the fifth force counselor doesn't just treat the anxiety.
No. The intervention might be helping the client role play, asking for a raise, or connecting them with a legal aid organization. It recognizes that sometimes the sickness isn't in your head, it's in your environment.
The counselor becomes an advocate, not just a doctor.
Exactly.
That is a massive shift. It's moving from let me fix you so you can tolerate the world to let's try to fix the world so it stops hurting you.
Exactly. It validates the client's reality. I see your struggle, and I see that the system is rigged against you. That validation alone can be incredibly healing.
So we've covered a lot. We've moved from the melting pot, which tries to erase difference, to the mosaic, which celebrates it. We've looked at the privilege walk and the importance of knowing where you stand before you try to help someone else.
And we've seen through John McGowan that cultural competence isn't just about race. It's about age, disability, economics, and communication style.
It seems like even if you aren't a counselor, these are just essential life skills for 2026.
Absolutely. Using the respectful checklist to understand a colleague, understanding that your worldview isn't the default view. That's essential for any leader, parent, or friend.
There was one final idea in the source material that I want to leave our listeners with. It's a redefinition of privilege that really stuck with me.
Yeah.
We often think of privilege as luxury yachts, private jets, VIP access.
But in this context, privilege is defined by what you don't have to think about.
That's the key. If you can walk into a store and not worry about being followed, that is a privilege. If you can apply for a job and not worry that your name sounds too ethnic, that is a privilege.
It's the absence of friction.
So here is our question for you to chew on. Look at your own life. Which parts of your identity do you never have to think about? Do you never think about your gender when you walk home at night? Do you never think about your physical ability when you approach a flight of stairs?
And how might that comfort, that silence be blinding you to the reality of the people around you who do have to negotiate those things every single day?
Something to think about. Thanks for diving in with us. We'll see you next time.